Welcome, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce the congregation Va-Dor, Rabbi Zvi Kahn. For a very long time, our congregation has been involved in interfaith dialogue. We've been able to converse with Buddhists, with Hindus, with Christians, with atheists, with people of all different backgrounds and stripes. But trying to find an Orthodox rabbi who will converse, that's been a bit of a challenge. And so I'm really thrilled that we have here someone who's very amiable and knowledgeable and very interested in promoting what we promote here, Jewish solidarity, and sharing ideas across the spectrum. I believe this is of critical importance today. Our community is fractured and divided like the rest of the nation as never before. This is very unhealthy. As we approach the high holy days, when we seek reconciliation and unity, there's a perfect opportunity now to welcome the high holiday season by having us reconcile and join together. Rabbi Kahn and I will not agree on everything, and we'll agree on certain things, but that has absolutely nothing to do with our ability to join together in friendship and fellowship and to share views and respect for one another. So I'm thrilled to have Rabbi Kahn here, and we're going to address what it is that Jews should be looking forward to, or how should we approach the high holidays? What is it that we need to atone for? What should we be focusing on this high holiday season? So for that, I turn it over to my distinguished colleague, Rabbi Zvi Kahn. Take it away.
Thank you, Rabbi Silver. Thank you for the introduction. I want to thank you and your congregation, Va-Dor, for inviting me to participate, as you said, and I'm a true believer in Jewish unity and in Klal Yisrael, all of the Jewish people coming together to do whatever we can to make the world a better place and whatever we can do to support each other. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the upcoming holidays and preparing for the high holidays as they approach. In thinking about this topic, it occurred to me that I think the central piece of this, there's a word that to me really encapsulates everything that we should be doing and thinking about to prepare for the holidays, and that is the word growth. If we leave growth out of the equation, if we're not thinking about how to grow as individuals and how to grow as a community and how to grow as a nation, as the nation of the Jewish people, then I think we've missed the boat. We've really missed an incredible opportunity that comes around only once a year. So it's a matter of growing. And when we talk about growth, the traditional, there's a wonderful a Jewish tradition, I should say, called Cheshbon HaNefesh in Hebrew. And what that means is to take an accounting, to take stock of ourselves and to take an accounting of ourselves and to really ask ourselves simple, straightforward, but sometimes difficult questions. Questions like, what kind of person do we want to be, and where are we in relationship to that? What kind of character traits do we have, and where are we on the scale, and each of those character traits, and how can we grow to become stronger and better reflect the values that we think we should have, and certainly in our relationships with other people, whether we're talking about family, which always has all kinds of dynamics and challenges, or whether or not we're talking about friends, whether or not we're talking about business associates, whether or not we're talking about what happens when we interact with strangers. All of those questions are important questions. And I think society, unfortunately, has moved away from the expectation, I guess is the best way to put it, that it's important for people to ask themselves these strong questions, to have times of introspection. Certainly, and nowadays, there are a lot of people who talk about living in the moment and meditation and things like that. And that's definitely a piece of this, or can be a piece of this. But really what's essential is simply for a person, for an individual, a man, a woman, for a person to say to himself or herself, I know that I'm not perfect. I know that no human being can be perfect. And the only way to improve and to grow as a human being is to occasionally challenge ourselves and really introspect and think about where we want to be, how we could be better, what it means to be better, which is not a simple question, you know, going back to the early roots of Judaism, but not only that, of course, to the Greeks, to Socrates, to Plato, to Aristotle, and continuing on through thinkers through all the ages, the question of what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to lead a good life? So just clarifying that question is critical, but then also asking ourselves, what are we doing to become better? Again, in relationship to our own lives and our own character, in relationships to other people. And of course, in Judaism, we talk about in relationship to Jewish values, in relationship to God. How do we, that's a lot. There's each one of these is a whole world into itself. But to me, everything starts there because, and this is the key point, if a person is not willing or doesn't know how or doesn't take the time to ask himself or herself those questions, then I think growth, true growth, spiritual growth, growth as a person, growth as a spouse, as a husband, as a wife, growth as a parent, growth as a child. I don't think those things are really possible unless we go through this process of challenging ourselves, asking ourselves sometimes difficult questions, and then really making a sincere effort to grow and become better in these areas. So for me, that's
Rabbi,
the key first point.
Rabbi, I just want to pick up on what you're talking about because I agree with you that cheshbon hanefesh is really important at this time. And my father, who's a rabbi until he was 95, used to talk about that as well and said that the people who do this the best, they're accountants. An accountant is someone who knows how to do cheshbon hanefesh. So he said, we should all be a CPA on the high holidays. We should be involved in cleaning, pressing, and alterations. We should cleanse our soul. We should press ourselves to do better. And we should seek an alteration in how we're behaving to improve and to behave better in the future. So I agree with you about all of that. And I also wanted to pick up on what you're talking about, growth. When you mentioned growth, what about Judaism? There seems to be some kind of dichotomy among the Jewish people. There are some who say we need to cling to tradition and we need to hold fast to our Jewish values. The progressive end of the religious spectrum, the Reform, Reconstructionists, Humanists say, no, we want tradition, but we want to grow. We want to modernize. We want to incorporate modern science. How do you see that balance? How do you see the growth of Judaism? Can Judaism grow to expand to include the findings of modern science and evolution, or is this not a proper way for growth to occur within Judaism?
Very important and a very fascinating, interesting question. I think that the fundamental tension, that you're describing is a tension between the desire to be authentic in the sense of, authentic to original Jewish sources, to the Chumash, to the Torah, to the Talmud, and that whole world of early Jewish sources and ancient Jewish sources. So there's a desire to say, hey, those are important and I want to be faithful to that and I want to be able to study those books and incorporate them into my lives on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there's the question of relevance. And when we talk about relevance, we're talking about contemporary relevance. In other words, I also, in addition to wanting to do the first thing, I also want to be a part of the world as it is right now, the modern world as it is right now. And the modern world as it is right now is not, we don't just mean geographically or physically, or even just in time. What we mean is the knowledge of the modern world. You mentioned science, the concepts of the modern world. And I think that for every person, not just every Jewish person, but in this case, since we're talking about Jewish values and traditions, there's a tension there. Between those two things. So I think your question about how do you find the proper balance is right on target. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that. In the Orthodox world that I'm a part of and that I was trained to be a rabbi in, and personally, and in my personal life as well, and in my family life as well, the way that question is handled is in the following way. Precedence is given to Jewish tradition, and that's considered the priority or the primary source for how to live as a Jewish person. However, that's not the end of the story. The concepts of relevance and taking into account the knowledge of the world and what the world has developed is also given a very important place. There's a wonderful statement in the Talmud which says that if we want to look for Torah values, we have to look within our Jewish tradition. But if we want to look for wisdom and knowledge, then that can come from sources around the world. And of course, that means the non-Jewish world, the wider world, completely the world. And so the idea of closing our eyes to the knowledge of the world and to the development of ideas and concepts is not something, in my opinion, and there may be those who disagree, but it's not something, in my opinion, that is part of a authentic Jewish approach. The authentic Jewish approach is to, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, is to say we have our Torah and Jewish values, and we have to take the knowledge of the world and integrate those two things. I think the best, although he's not a modern figure, he lived about 1,000 years ago, but I think one of the great proponents of this idea was Maimonides, the Rambam, who lived in the end of the 11th century, early 12th century in Spain, and then ultimately moved to Israel, and then Egypt. But he specifically said, he stated in many places in his works, that we must integrate the two things. We must integrate science and the knowledge of the world with our knowledge of Torah. And he said, if you ever do that and you come to a point when you think they contradict and it can't be resolved, he said, then your knowledge of one of the two areas must be faulty. So either your knowledge of Judaism and the Torah is faulty, or your knowledge of science and scientific realities is faulty. And we know that both of those things have happened many, many times, meaning that there have been ideas in Judaism that as time has passed, people have looked back and say that was a mistake. That just didn't really, doesn't fit with as our knowledge has developed. That was a faulty understanding, so to speak. And then on the other hand, we know that in science, ideas change all the time. So things that were at one time considered scientific facts really turned out to be theories, and later on they were revised. Sometimes they were dropped completely and rejected. And I remember being in a college biology class, and the professor said, always keep in mind that whatever we learn 100 years from now, they're going to laugh at. And I don't know if he meant that to be literally true, but there's a certain important piece of that as well. Our knowledge of science grows, and our knowledge of Torah also grows and develops, and we have to just always try and work those two together to the best of our ability.
It sounds to me like you're raising fundamental issues about what could we actually believe. If you say science changes and Judaism, our understanding changes, it seems like there's a lack of a foundation that we can count on, which is really one of the attacks that has been leveled against the Reform and Reconstructionist movements, that if you don't have anything that you can base your wisdom on, then everything's up for grabs. But I wanted to ask you specifically about the theory of evolution. Evolution seems to some people to represent a dagger to the heart of their belief system, whether it be Orthodox Judaism, fundamentalist Christianity, or Islam. Others have seemed to try to find a way to reconcile. What's your take specifically on evolution? Because if evolution is true, then Adam and Eve is myth, the story of Noah, the flood, this is all mythology. And they seem to be completely irreconcilable. Do you see it that way? And how do you view evolution? Is it something that we can incorporate into Judaism, or is this something that is so contradictory that it has no place?
I don't think that they're irreconcilable necessarily, but I'm going to get to that in a second. But I do want to go back and address your first point, if I may, that you made a moment ago. I did not intend to make the point that we have no foundational truths. What I was hoping to convey is that the Torah, the Talmud, the traditional sources of Judaism, Jewish thought, Jewish philosophy, Jewish ideas, Jewish law, is our foundation. That is our source. However, once it's been given into the hands of people, then the understanding of the Torah sources, certainly we know that it's full of disagreements. You can't open any page of the Talmud without seeing different opinions and argumentation. And that's a wonderful Jewish tradition, but it also means that sometimes we have to decide and say, this is the normative approach and not this. This is the way we're going to act and conduct ourselves, and not according to this other approach that might also have its adherents and its supporters as well in the traditional sources. So what I'm kind of arguing for, what I'm advocating for, I should say, not arguing for, advocating for, or trying to convey, is the idea of saying that the books of Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, as I mentioned, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the earliest books of the rabbis, Those books really are our foundation, and that's where our basic Jewish values and Jewish reality, so to speak, come from. But then not to ignore and forget the rest of the world, but rather to study the knowledge of the world. So many of our great, actually going back to the Talmud, so many of our great the rabbis in our tradition studied the knowledge of the world, and whether it was astronomy, whether it was medicine, and tried to incorporate that into their Jewish values. But to get to your question of evolution, my understanding is as follows, and I think this is clearly can be found in Jewish traditional sources, although again, not everybody is aware of these sources, and they probably should be. One approach, at least within Orthodox Judaism, is to say evolution is at most a theory, and it's not a correct theory, and it's been, according to this train of thought, and it's been disproven, or it's been seriously challenged in many ways. And by the way, you can find scientists in the modern time who have written books or articles and on this subject of evidence that points against the theory, Darwinian evolution. And so therefore, it's really not something that we have to worry too much about. That's one approach. Happens not to be my approach, but that is one approach. Another approach within Orthodox Jewish sources is to say that not everything that we read in the Torah is intended or was ever intended to be taken literally. Not everything. For example, the age of the world. If we read the biblical story, and of course we all know in the beginning God created the world and there are the 6 days, then we're talking about a universe that is in the area of 6,000 years old. And yet there are great rabbis and great thinkers in the Jewish tradition who talk about a world that's much longer than that. And what they say is that when it says in the beginning, in Genesis, in the beginning of the Torah, when it talks about a day, it didn't mean a 24-hour day. It meant a day in the, so to speak, eyes of God who had created the world, and human beings didn't live yet. So it's not a human concept of a day. It's God's day, and God's day can be 1,000 years, as the example of as the Talmud states, or God's day can be much longer than that. So they make space within the Jewish tradition for an idea of a much older universe than 6,000 years. And that's one example of that. Could it be that the processes that we read about of the growth of different organisms could come through an evolutionary process? Could that be part of the process? Again, there are Jewish thinkers, very legitimate, authentic Jewish thinkers who have posited yes and said yes, that could have been part of the process. Where the fundamental kind of two things might hit each other in a way that might be irreconcilable is the idea of, is God part of this process? Is there a God? Is there a creator to this universe and a designer of this universe? And was that being responsible for the process? If a person who believes in evolution says, yeah, that's possible, and I want to talk for just in a moment about Darwin, and I don't want to monopolize all the time, but if a person says, yeah, that's possible, evolution could exist with some kind of God, we don't have scientific proof for that, but that's not here nor there. It's just evolution is the way things happen, the mechanism, the engineering process. And if you want to believe that there's a God who did that, no problem. It's not here nor there. Then that can work, so to speak. If a person believes in evolution and says, well, this finishes off any ideas of religion or God, or at least theology, because this happened kind of automatically and through steps that had nothing to do with God, then I think that would be, at least again from my point of view, would be not be able to be reconciled. But I think it's interesting to the point about Darwin. My understanding, I could be wrong, I've read a little bit about Darwin, is that he was a believing Christian and a practicing Christian, and that even after developing his theory of evolution and supporting it and writing his books, he continued to be a believing and practicing Christian, which to me means that at least to him, he didn't think Christianity had been debunked, that Christianity had been repudiated. So I think that's interesting to think about it, just in terms of throwing that in the mix.
Let me just speak about Darwin for a moment, because I'm pretty familiar with his theories and his thinking. Darwin went to divinity school. His father deeply wanted him to become a minister. And he went to divinity school and he studied the Bible. Then he was also a naturalist, and he came to the conclusion that the two were completely irreconcilable. Didn't mean he didn't believe in God. It meant that he didn't believe in the biblical view of creation. He thought that was irreconcilable. Later on in his life, he came across a phenomenon about a particular type of wasp. The wasp stings a caterpillar and stuns the caterpillar, so it's still alive, but it cannot move. It's immobile, but alive and conscious. The wasp then lays its eggs inside the body of the living caterpillar, which cannot move. And then the eggs of the wasp proceed to feed off of the living body of the caterpillar. At that point, Darwin says in his notes, I realized that it's impossible for there to be a beneficent God. The view of a God who is all good and all powerful, who would create a species that would feed off the living body of a caterpillar, is irreconcilable. And I cannot conceive that there would be a God who would create such a creature. And so to his dying day, he still held out some notion that evolution could have been and somehow a divine process, but the biblical view of creation, he rejected. Now, and I wanted to ask you again, Rabbi, about that. It seems to me that if you accept the view of evolution, that human beings evolved from lower forms or more primitive forms, it's irreconcilable with Adam and Eve. The story of Adam and Eve could not possibly be true, nor could the story of the flood and the Tower of Babel. So you could, for you in particular, do you believe that Adam and Eve lived, and does Orthodox Judaism rise and fall on the validity of the story of Adam and Eve, or is there a way to say that I accept evolution of human beings from lower forms and still remain Orthodox and still remain Jewish?
First of all, thank you for the explanation about Darwin. I had never heard that story, and I bow to your wisdom about Darwin. The story of the wasp, just as a total aside, strikes me as a little strange that had the impact on him, because forgetting the wasp and the caterpillar, walking outside any day, we see that species survive by eating and consuming other species. So Darwin, I imagine, must have been very bothered by that theologically or philosophically very early on. Why did God create all the species that eat big fish, eat little fish, and big animals eat little animals? So,
well, Rabbi, that's particularly why he rejected what he learned at divinity school and dropped out. But what was a real deal breaker for him, which really made it come crashing home to his mind, was that particular species. But you're right, it wasn't just that. That was just an example, a grotesque example of the entire scenario that doesn't seem to be the product of a good, beneficent God. But anyway, go ahead.
Gotcha. But the question, the way you phrase it about evolution, reminds me of I'm trying to remember the name of the movie. I think it was Inherit the Wind, about the monkey trial, which wonderful, wonderful old movie that everyone should see if they haven't seen it. And certainly these issues came very much to the fore. That's what that whole story was about, that based on the true story, of course. I would ask it this way. I would ask the question this way. Is it possible that evolution took place, and let's even say, and I'm not conceding this, but let's even say, according to Darwin, let's take it all the way and say we're accepting Darwin, hook, line, and sinker, and evolution led all the way to the development of human beings through early prototypes of human beings, and then, actual human beings as we know the Homo sapiens as we know them today. Is it possible? Is it not possible? I guess I would phrase it to say that yes, that took place, and then at a certain point, when you had the first Homo sapiens as we know them today, that there began a communication between God and those people, and those people, as things developed, experienced the things that the Bible talks about, whether it's the flood or the tower or other types of events. What I'm trying to say is, I don't know. I think it would take really more thought and focus on the texts in the Torah itself to say, to pose that question, to answer that question. Why couldn't there have development of human beings through evolutionary processes? And then the critical step from a Jewish point of view is that God, exists, and God begins to communicate with human beings, and then all kinds of other events happen and take place, whether it's with Noah and the flood, whether it's with Abraham and his mission and the beginning and the roots of the Jewish people. So I would say that, to me, is something worth thinking about if a person is trying to reconcile. my own feeling, since you asked me my own feeling, and I want to make it absolutely clear, I don't speak, I'm not a representative of Orthodox Judaism. I was never elected or appointed to that position. So I can't speak for Orthodox Judaism.
Well, I'll put in a good vote for you if you want.
I appreciate that. Is not monolithic. There are all kinds of different thoughts and schools of thought within Orthodox Judaism and Judaism at large as well, of course. I personally feel that evolution as a part of the story of how things could have, how organisms could have developed in the world, I have a certain comfort level with that. The idea that human beings developed strictly through that, and all human beings are descended from earlier creatures without a more direct involvement of God, I'm less comfortable with that. Although, as a moment ago, I feel I'm trying to say I think that could be an acceptable position to take as well. But I think the essential message of Judaism, in a way, one of the essential messages of Judaism, is that human beings are extremely significant. They're not the only creatures in this world, but they're extremely significant, and and it's important to understand that they are capable of having a relationship with God, whereas other organisms in the world don't have that relationship. And that, to me, is a critical point that distinguishes possibly pure evolutionists, from who would say, well, all species are equal. We're all just descended from different organisms, and there's there's no God, or if there is a God, he certainly has no consideration for human beings being more significant, more important, and would have no desire to have a relationship with them. So on that point, I think that's where I would differ the most strong.
Let me just share my point of view about this so people can understand the different ways of looking at it. From my point of view, first of all, as far as evolution being just a theory, the word theory is misunderstood by many people. Theory has two definitions in science. One is conjecture, something that we're not sure about. Another definition of theory, which applies to evolution, is an overarching explanation that explains many, many diverse scientific facts in one comprehensive manner to make it understandable. For instance, we have something called the theory of gravity, or gravitational theory. There's no scientist who questions whether gravity actually exists. It's just a way of understanding it. There's also the germ theory of disease. There are no scientists who question whether germs cause disease. There's also the heliocentric theory of the solar system, which means that the sun is at the center and explains how everything moves about. So when it comes to evolution, there are no scientists, none, reputable scientists, real scientists who dispute evolution. It happens every day. We can even see it when a bacteria evolves so that it defeats the measures that we take to try antibiotics. We see it in dogs, how they've been raised to have different forms of dogs from just human intervention, from artificial selection. So nobody doubts evolution, and no real scientists doubt that human beings are the product of evolution. There's too many fossils, too many stages, too many discoveries, too many intermediary phases from Australopithecus to humans. There's no scientists who dispute that. So the difficulty is then that certain people feel that they must cling to the biblical view, so they try to shut out science or rationalize science or explain it away and say different theories. There's no doubt that evolution is a dagger to fundamentalism, because in the Bible it says God specifically created human beings in a day, in an instant. He just created. There's no discussion at all about human beings evolving over millions of years. Not only that, in the Torah, there's actually, I'm sure as you know, Rabbi, there's two different versions of evolution. There's two different versions of creation of human beings. In one version, man comes first, and at the other one, he comes last. In one version, humans are created together, man and woman. In the other one, Adam's created, and he needs a companion, and the animals don't really do it for him. So he says to God, I need someone who's like me. Then he puts him to sleep, and then woman comes out. These stories are completely irreconcilable with evolution. And so I believe, as you were talking about growth, I think that in order for Judaism to grow, it must accept scientific truth and I try to evade it and find a way to incorporate it into Judaism, much like Maimonides did. That I believe if Maimonides was alive today, and he had the benefit of Darwinian evolution, and as well as the fact that the earth is round and is not in the center of the universe as we once thought, he might come to some very different conclusions. I also think that it's consistent with Judaism to acknowledge change. And you mentioned that also in the beginning. Change, learning new things, rabbis and scholars and everyday people discussing different trends and finding a way to understand the Torah in different ways is what Judaism is all about. We no longer sacrifice animals. We no longer stone a disrespectful child. We no longer stone a woman if when she gets married she's not a virgin. We no longer execute people for violating the Sabbath, for picking up sticks, nor do we wipe out entire nations because they're worshiping the wrong God or in the wrong way. Judaism has grown and evolved. So the concept that we should accept the teachings of science and figure out a way to incorporate them, that's what Judaism is all about. You could argue that to not do that, to deny the growth of Judaism and to deny the ability to enlarge our understanding and use that to enlarge our understanding of Judaism is really un-Jewish. It's really going against the grain. And it's very interesting in speaking to you, Rabbi, it seems to me that Reform and Orthodox really have much in common. That both Reform and Orthodox do accept the fact that understandings change and evolve. And I think that the rift between Reform and Orthodox is more contrived than real. I think that we share much in common, and that's why I'm glad that you're here today in order to discuss these things, because I think that maybe we've been separated by a lover's quarrel, and that the diametric opposition that we seem to have for each other is more illusory than real. And I think that there's great benefit in speaking to one another to try to understand the other and to realize that we're both doing our best to grapple with Judaism and to understand how Judaism can grow and develop. So maybe you could, I'd just like to hear your feedback on that. And then I want to bring up a few things about the new year specifically, about how we can approach the new year.
Absolutely. So I have to say, you know, it's important. The whole point of this dialogue and discussion is to be totally honest and candid with each other. So on some of the points that you made, I agree. And some of them, I really disagree quite strongly. So in terms of the agreement, the idea that Jewish people should seek unity of all backgrounds and stripes, should seek unity, should seek discussion, should talk together, should learn together, should study together. I absolutely agree with you. And I don't know if you remember, I think you probably do, but what motivated me to contact you was I had read the column, one of your columns, and you talked there about the fact that one of the main principles of your congregation and your own viewpoints was, let us reason together. Come, let's discuss, let's reason together. Let's think about things, discuss things, and have open minds in those discussions. And that's really, I couldn't agree more with that. However, we also have to sometimes agree to disagree. We have to know that sometimes we are coming from very different vantage points. So the idea, I do believe that the Reform approach, which I've had the opportunity to read about and to study, but certainly nowhere near a man like yourself and other Reform rabbis and other Reform scholars, but I've made the effort to try and read about its background, its history, and how it's developed, and I know a little bit about that, and I've devoted my life to studying Orthodoxy and how it's developed and its texts and its traditions. Are coming from very, very different, I don't want to say diametrically opposed, but very, very different viewpoints in terms of their approach to Judaism. I would say this and be interested if you would disagree, because to me, I think it's axiomatic, and I think it's, more importantly, I think it's true. In the Orthodox world, a person cannot be considered truly knowledgeable and certainly not scholarly without investing a tremendous amount of time into the study of the ancient books of our tradition, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, the Bible, and the books of the Mishnah and the Talmud, and so many commentaries on that. That's our bread and butter, so to speak, and that is what we base our life on. And Even today, if one went to an Orthodox rabbi and said, how should I handle a certain situation, whether it's a business dealing, whether it's a ritual situation, the rabbi would turn around and pull off the shelf these types of books of the Torah, books of the Talmud, books of the codes of Jewish law, which were, written 500 years ago, the famous Code of Jewish Law, and then more modern books of Jewish law as well. But it's all based on that system. It seems to me, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, that a person could be considered knowledgeable Jewishly from a Reform perspective without anywhere near that level of intensive study and intensive dedication and commitment of a lifelong effort to those books. And I'm not criticizing that at all. I think a Reform person might say, listen, those things are very nice, but there's a whole world out there of knowledge and poetry and literature and sociology and psychology and politics and counseling people. And there's all kinds of other things that a person really should be focused on in order to be an effective advocate and an effective, knowledgeable person in the Reform world. And therefore, I think we're just talking about two very, very different approaches. Does that resonate with you at all? Do you think that?
Absolutely. I think you've really encapsulated one of the fundamental differences between the two. To me, the main difference between the Orthodox and Reform, by the way, I'm not a Reform rabbi. My congregation began as Reform, and my father was an ordained Reform rabbi, and I appreciate much of Reform, as I do many denominations, but I formed something I call a cosmic Judaism. It unites Judaism and science, but I'm steeped in Reform and Reconstructionist tradition, and I was raised Reform. But what you have articulated, I think, really hits the nail on the head. I think you've done a very good job of doing it. That the Orthodox believes that the traditional scriptures and writings of our people, the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Torah, the sayings of the rabbis, the Shulchan Aruch, I mean, all of these things, you can't possibly be considered knowledgeable or wise without knowing these writings and this thinking in depth, and also use that as a basis for your decision making. You hit it right on the head. And I think the let's just call it the progressive approach. You could link Reform, Reconstructionist, humanistic Judaism, has a different point of view, in that so many things have occurred since those days that tend to make so much of this obsolete that it's basing something on a false premise. It would be as if there were writings that said 2 + 2 is 5, and then there's volumes and volumes and volumes of writings based on that premise. And you would say, well, that's very interesting, but I believe 2 and 2 is 4, so I'm going to go in a different direction. So to a progressive Jewish person, a lot of these writings are interesting, but they're not really relevant, and they don't really help us to ascertain how to deal with reality. For instance, the Torah is based on God's revelation, in which he has, as I mentioned, very many primitive barbaric rules. I mean, you're being executed for not being a virgin on your wedding day, or not observing the Sabbath the right way, or you're being commanded to kill people if they don't agree with you. I mean, to base anything on this literally is dangerous. And the Talmud also has, it's a step forward. There's a lot of things in it that are rather primitive. There's certain notions even that to kill a non-Jew isn't really murder because they don't have a neshama. I mean, there's certain things in the Talmud that are also a step ahead. But a lot of this, to the modern sensibilities, it's just not something we base our lives on, especially when it comes to how to treat women, how to treat non-Jews, to how to treat Jewish law. So that there's just a lot of stuff in it. So the modern Jew believes that these things, what I base my life on are Jewish principles of kindness, of rahmanas, of emet, of tzedek, and chesed, and these Jewish principles. And I look at the Torah, the Talmud, the Mishnah, the writings of Maimonides and other scholars, I look at as the evolution of Jewish thought, of where we came from and where we're moving to. And I would say this, the fundamental difference between the Orthodox, and let's just say myself and other, I guess, progressive Jewish people, is that the Orthodox believes that God wrote the Torah, and therefore it's infallible. And if there's anything in it, anything at all that seems to us primitive, barbaric, archaic, if there's anything like that at all, it's only because we don't get it. We don't understand it. And if we really studied the Mishnah and the Talmud and the writings of the rabbis, we would understand how it all becomes God's law. To me, that's just a futile effort at rationalizing the irrational or justifying the unjustifiable. It represents a primitive stage of Jewish development, which we do not embrace as God's truth. And to me, revelation comes from Jewish ideals and from science. Science is the greatest revelation of all. It really explains to us where we come from. But science alone doesn't do the trick. It's Einstein who said that science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. And we need to join the two together. But we don't have that much time left. And I do want to focus in on another thing that's going on right now and ask your opinion about this. And that is the cataclysmic changes that are occurring in the United States based on race relations and the protests that are going on now over police violence, the basketball players. That's why I got my basketball shirt on. I'm in solidarity. I'm a basketball coach. My son plays basketball. And it seems like it's kind of like a day of judgment. Like a judgment is being given on American society. And some people are judging American society very harshly and saying this racism is not just in the past, it's today. And it's something that Jews should be concerned about when we approach the high holidays. This should be a focus, judging our society. And there's others who are saying, no. This is not a problem anymore. These people are overreacting and they shouldn't politicize it and make an issue of it in basketball games, and there shouldn't be any rioting. I just want to say for the record, I find the rioting and the violence absolutely reprehensible, and it's horrendous. And I think that the Democratic Party and the progressives have failed to sufficiently demonstrate outrage against it, and it ruins the entire movement. And I also find that on the conservative side, they've failed to really recognize the injustices that are going on. And as an attorney, I sued the police over injustices, discrimination, violence, and I've also represented the police officers themselves in case of discrimination. So I see both sides. And I think this is a time for judgment. And I want to get your opinion, Rabbi. Is this something that Jews should be concerned about as we approach the high holidays, or is this peripheral to what our main focus should be?
Thank you for asking that question and for phrasing it in that way. From the earliest Jewish sources tell us and teach us that we have to be concerned with the society around us, with the non-Jewish society around us, and that if we live in a country which is not a Jewish-controlled country, or I should say, even if it's not a Jewish-controlled country, we should pray for the success of that country, for the peace of that country, of that government and its leaders. And of course, we do that whether they're Republican or Democrat or independent or anything else. The point is not a political statement. The point is to say that Jews know that order in society and forces in society that can quell violence and whatever the appropriate means are to quell violence and stop looting and stop killing and all of those, and stop destruction of property. Those are the most important, those are incredibly important roles for the government to serve and to have for all of us in a society to live in peace. So I would say, yes, it's extremely important for Jews to be reading about these issues, thinking about these issues, taking position on these issues. And what you said a moment ago about having absolutely no room in your heart and your mind for the violence, I agree with you 100%. And to be honest, I don't believe that's a question that reasonable people can or should disagree about. I think there's no question that there are injustices still in our society, and as Jews, we have to be especially sensitive to that. You know, my own father was told when he wanted to go to dental school, we have a quota. There are already 5 Jews in the dental school. Sorry, you'll have to come back next year. And that's one tiny reflection of how it used to be for Jews in this country, and of course, much, much worse. But African Americans in our country have suffered from the earliest days, and until today, I think any realistic, reasonable person would say, yes, there is still racism in certain segments of our society. So is there a cause, is there a reason for people in this country, black or white or any color, Jew or Gentile or any religion, to talk about these issues, to work on things like police reform, to work on equality, Absolutely 100%. Again, to me, that's obvious. It's self-evident. But as soon as people cross the line and they say, we are so angry, we are so upset, we feel so mistreated that we are allowed to mistreat others. We now should be allowed to destroy the property of others. We should be allowed to burn things down. We should be allowed to hurt other people, pull someone out of a car and beat the person. No reasonable person, no ethical and moral person can justify that. And I think that's exactly where the Jewish community should be. And often we're in that middle position of saying, hey, it's not black or white, it's something in the middle. Yes, these people have valid grievances, but violence is not the answer. Violence is the antithesis of the answer. And we just have to look back to Martin Luther King and the Jewish leaders who marched with him. And of course, not all did, not enough did. But that was the idea. Yes, there's a valid grievance here, but civil disobedience, nonviolent disobedience is the approach.
Thanks, Rabbi. It's true that the Jewish people, actually the first head of the NAACP was Jewish, and the Jewish people led the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, and some of them died and paid with their lives fighting for the rights of African Americans. I agree with you that no reasonable people disagree about violence. Everybody condemns it, but my problem with the progressive movement is they're a little slow to do it, and they don't do it sufficiently to express the sufficient outrage against it and allow it to permeate. Sure, they're going to say, yeah, we don't agree with violence, but for instance, Black Lives Matter, which as a movement is important to recognize that Black Lives Matter, but the organization itself has some very dark undertones, anti-Semitic undertones as an organization, and violent undertones, and even violence against police. The organization itself is very different than the movement. And I think that on the progressive side, we've been very slow or not reacting at all to blatant anti-Semitism, which has permeated parts of this movement. And we as Jews need to speak out against it, not just to protect our own interests, but anyone who curses the Jews will be cursed. Anyone who blesses the Jews will be blessed. And any movement that is based on anti-Semitism is doomed and condemned to fail. And so we need to speak up about that. Another issue I wanted to ask you about is the climate change right now. And we're seeing forests burning in California. We're seeing horrific hurricanes happening in the Gulf, and our hearts go out to the tremendous suffering. And we see political leaders who just deny it and say it's all a hoax, and that this shouldn't. Do you believe that Judgment Day, not just on Rosh Hashanah, but Judgment Day is approaching for America and for the world by failing to deal with the climate crisis, that bad things are coming our way, and that on the high holidays, we should atone for the sins that we've committed against the planet and try to take us in a new direction, instead of denying the problem, addressing it and dealing with it. And also, it seems to me like there's no divine authority is going to step in and save us from ourselves, that this is a problem that if we don't deal with it, like we're seeing in Louisiana and California, we're going to pay a heavy price. Do you see Judgment Day coming? And is this an issue that you think Jewish people should speak out about?
The climate change issue, the scientific issues involved are way beyond my level of understanding and discussing. I know that there are all kinds of different views on both sides. I tend to feel from my limited reading and my limited attempts at research to say that there's definitely an issue and definitely a problem. It seems to be, it seems to be that that's how the building blocks shape up, even though you have your deniers, et cetera, et cetera. Whether or not the issues and the problems that are human created, I mean, that's what humanity is doing to the world. Whether or not that means there's an apocalyptic future coming, God forbid, in the near future, I certainly hope not, and we all have to pray not. But I guess so for that, I don't have anything much I can add except to hope that it's not true, and to admit that there's no doubt that human beings are doing all kinds of things to damage the planet that in our environment that we have to really think about and figure out ways to change, which is not at all uncomplicated. I think that on your question of Is it an issue for the Jewish community to think about and to discuss and talk about? Absolutely. I've been in Jewish schools my whole life, and one of the most important lessons that we teach little children and then try and reinforce it for older children is the idea of living here shouldn't be on earth, being alive on earth shouldn't be taken for granted. It's a gift from God, and it's a gift to live in a world where the entire system, the entire biosphere, everything, we can breathe the air, we can drink the water, we can benefit, enjoy, we can eat the food. All of it is here for our use and our benefit, and we have to protect it. And we have to do it because it's not just because it's the right thing to do, because otherwise we're not going to survive. And so I think that fundamental lesson, of course, is extremely valid, important for Jews to discuss. But will there always on these kinds of issues be a wide variety of viewpoints? What is the best way? How serious is the problem? How can we rectify it? Absolutely. And I'm not an expert. I think only experts can really talk on that with real.
I think the experts have already spoken. The problem is that a lot of people in high office are not listening to this, like they didn't listen with the coronavirus. I think you might agree with me that if you believe in a creator or a creative power, and that the universe or the world and all the creatures on it were created in some divine fashion or some wondrous fashion, that to drive species into extinction and to treat our planet as a garbage heap is really a form of blasphemy and sacrilege against the creator. One more question I want to ask you, and then I want to get your parents in the mix, and we don't have that much time left. We're running out of time, but I'll do this quickly. I saw the visit by Pompeo to Jerusalem, and I immediately thought visit to Jerusalem by his namesake Pompey over 2,000 years ago, who was also invited into Jerusalem by Jewish people when Hyrcanus and Aristobulus were fighting in a civil war. One of them invited him in to weigh in and to try to give him some leverage. And when he came into Jerusalem, that was the last time that Jews were independent and had sovereignty over the Holy Land. So do you worry about the fact that we're doing the same thing again? History's repeating itself. We're inviting now Pompey's successor, Pompeo, into Jerusalem to take sides on an issue. Is that now going to destroy Jewish independence in the Holy Land? I just wonder what you have to say about that.
First things first, I want to say that for a man who not that just a few minutes ago said that the ancient books in the Talmud were not that necessarily important, you're the first person, rabbi, anyone I know who made the connection, the wonderful, interesting, fascinating, thought-provoking connection between and Pompey. I never would have made that connection, and that's a pretty good Talmudic source to drop out.
See, Rabbi, we're not all that ignorant about the Talmud. We might not base our lives on it, but we have some familiarity with it.
Well, I tip my hat, and I don't believe that, of course. Look, the only thing that bothered me about the Pompeo thing wasn't anything extreme at all. It's just that I do think it's important nowadays, especially, and this is for Democrats, Republicans, for everybody, to maintain a system of order and decorum. And if something hasn't been done, in this case, a sitting Secretary of State involved in running foreign affairs, that's his portfolio, and here he is. Talking about the election and partisan politics from Jerusalem of all places. I don't think that's appropriate. But do I think it's the worst thing that ever happened? No, I don't. I think we really have to somehow, and I don't know how, somehow bring back the sense of respect that the two sides, for the most part, with many exceptions, but had towards each other and differences. And one way to do that is to say, let's respect the norms and the political norms and political traditions of the past. I'm not in favor of just changing everything, because the more things we change, the less structure there is that helps us maintain the amazing democracy that this country has flourished on, since its inception. And so I say keep the traditions, and that happens to be a good tradition, to have a separation of the present political figures and the Secretary of State.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi. And I think it's really important that Jews stop fighting with each other, and that we unite, and that we engage in dialogue as we're doing today. So I appreciate what you're saying, and we certainly should not be fighting and using Israel as a political pawn. It does not make sense for one side to be yelling or screaming at the other and saying you're anti-Israel, you're an enemy of Israel. Let's let all Jews unite behind Israel. And we might have different views about Israel, but even in Israel, they have different views about Israel, but they're not accused of being self-hating Jews or anti-Semites. So I think we really need to support Israel at this critical time, and the best way to do that is for all the Jewish people to unite around our support of Israel. And if we have disagreements, to disagree agreeably and to not make accusations. The final thing I want to do before we leave, and I really appreciate your being here. It was a great discussion. I appreciate your open-mindedness and also your knowledge and your wisdom. I just wanted to get your parents into the act, because I know your parents are listening in. I think it's wonderful that your parents are here with us, and I'd just like to hear from them and maybe have them share some thoughts or comments about the discussion that we had and about what they think about their son. So
please, I beg you not to ask that question, because you know how Jewish parents are, and I don't know. Maybe more about the discussion. How about that?
All right, I invite Carol and Saul Kahn to join us now in the conversation. I'm going to ask Sharon to let them in before we conclude. So Sharon, could you unmute them? And let's hear what they have to say.
They're okay. Unmuted. They don't have their video. They're not turning their video back on.
All right. Carol and Saul, can you hear us?
Yes, the whole thing.
Go ahead. Share with us your thoughts about what we were talking about.
Well, I think it's been very exciting and inspiring and just so interesting, and has given us so much to think.
Carol, we can't hear you.
Oh.
Please turn on your video and raise your volume.
My video is on, and I do.
Carol, just click on the little start video at the bottom.
I think maybe I should drive over there.
How long a drive is it to your folks' house?
2 minutes, 3 minutes at the most.
Oh yeah, you live at the Circle, right? Montoya Circle, in that area?
Yeah, they're right on the Circle, and I'm on the Circle as well.
Yeah.
How about the volume? Mom, can you talk maybe a little closer to your microphone?
I'm trying.
All right, it's a little better. Go ahead.
Okay. So I said, can you hear me?
A little bit.
Okay. So I said that the whole program has been very exciting for us to watch, and I appreciate very much, Rabbi Silver, your thoughts, and of course our son. We're very, very proud of him, and he loves everybody and is a total non-judgment person, and he's a big inspiration to us as well. And certainly you have been an inspiration this morning. I thank you.
Well, thank you very much for joining the discussion. I compliment you on raising a fine scholar and an advocate for Jewish values. It's great to have you on, and I hope perhaps you'll watch one of our Shabbat celebrations to see what we do. We unite the best of all Jewish traditions, including the Orthodox, and try to bring all Jews, if we can't do it under one roof because we're not in a building, at least under one link. So you're welcome to join us. It's a congregation Va-Dor, and Rabbi Kahn. After the service at 8:30, we have an interactive discussion, and I guess you wouldn't be able to do that because it's on a Friday night. But I hope to engage in future discussions with you, and any topics you'd like to address, just let us know. And I am extremely grateful to you for sharing your views, your knowledge, your amiability, and your desire to bring Jewish people together and to use reason and logic and Jewish values to try to make this world a better place. I really compliment you, and I compliment your parents as well for raising you, and I appreciate their presence here. So thank you very much, and I'll let you make any concluding comments if you'd like before we close.
I just want to, thank you, Rabbi, and Sharon also for putting for handling the technical issues. This was very exciting, very fascinating, and interesting, and I think it's a wonderful example of what's possible when people talk openly, share their values. They're not afraid to disagree, but they do so respectfully, and they have an open mind to listen to other viewpoints. And I really enjoyed it, and the honor you showed my parents, I can't thank you enough, and the honor you showed me. So thank you very much.
Thank you and sei gesund.
Sei
And Lashana Tova.